Did you know that Squid Game is actually based on real-life events? While the games in the show are fictional, their eerie similarity to one of South Korea's darkest chapters makes them even more chilling. The real story is called Brothers Home. In 1986, this state-subsidized welfare facility in Busan was created to clean up the streets as South Korea prepared to host the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Seoul Olympics. But what really happened inside was nothing short of a nightmare.
Cut!
Brothers Home was a place where orphans, homeless people, and even children were rounded up. Often under false pretenses, they claimed it was for their welfare. But instead, these people were exploited for forced labor. Those who refused to work were beaten, abused, or worse, killed. Just like in Squid Game, the inmates were forced to wear matching uniforms, stripped of their identities, and reduced to numbers. They worked under horrifying conditions with no escape. Officially, it's reported that 551 people died at the facility, but survivors believe the real number is far higher. If families reported their missing loved ones, the cases were ignored. Why? Because the government secretly funded this place. It was a twisted money-making operation disguised as a welfare facility. Today, survivors are still fighting for justice, and those who turned a blind eye to their suffering. Inside Brothers Home, up to 120 people were crammed into rooms with rows of bunk beds. Punishments were handed out for even the smallest mistakes, like dropping food on the floor. Many tried to escape, but few succeeded. For most, Brothers Home became a death sentence. The parallels between Squid Game and Brothers Home are striking. Both showcase how the powerful exploit the powerless. And both reveal the lengths institutions will go to cover up their actions. But while Squid Game is fictional, the horrors of Brothers Home are very real. The victims of Brothers Home may have been silenced, but their stories demand to be heard. And as we watch Squid Game, it's a sobering reminder of how systems of power can destroy lives in the name of profit. I came across a Reddit thread from someone who says they survived Brothers Home in 1986. Their story is intense and heartbreaking, so I wanted to read it for you. It's a bit long, but I'll do my best to read it clearly so you can really take it in. Han Jong-soon still clearly remembers the moment he was abducted with his sister. It was a beautiful autumn day in 1984, and Han, then 8 years old, was enjoying a long-hoped-for trip to the city with his busy father. But Han's father still had a few errands to run, and he decided the quickest and safest thing to do would be to leave the children with an officer at a police substation for a few minutes. That police officer would tear the family apart. A bus stopped in front of the police substation and we were forced into the bus. Han recalls more than 30 years later. A police officer exchanged unknown signs with the people who got off the bus. We had no idea where we were taken to. Daddy told us to wait here. Daddy is coming. We cried and bawled. They started beating us, saying that we were too loud. The bus was taking them to Hyungjibokjiwon, a private facility that was officially a welfare center. But in reality, allege those who survived, it was a brutal detention center which held thousands of people against their will, some for years on end. Warning: some readers may find some of these details upsetting. According to testimonies and evidence gathered from the site, detainees say they were used as labor at construction sites, farms, and factories during the 1970s and 80s. They were also allegedly with hundreds dying under the inhumane conditions. The facility at Hyungjibokjiwon has been compared to a concentration camp, but its story is not widely known, and nobody, to this day, has been held accountable for the atrocities that reportedly happened within its walls. For Han and his sister, their arrival was the start of a nightmare which would last 3.5 years and forever change the course of their lives. Social purification projects. In the 1980s, South Korea was booming economically. It had achieved incredible growth, overcoming the scars of the Korean War in the 1950s, after which the Korean peninsula was split into North and South. The whole country was in a fever ahead of the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Seoul Olympics, and the government began spurring on the nation's rebranding efforts. But behind the so-called miracle of Han River was a brutal and dark reality. In April 1981, a letter arrived at the office of then Prime Minister Nam Duk-woo. The letter, handwritten by President Chun Doo-hwan, a former general who had seized power through a military coup a year earlier, ordered the authorities to crack down on begging and take protective measures for vagrants. Under the ordinance which allowed arbitrary detention of vagrants, social welfare centers were set up, and buses with signs that read, "Vagrants Transport Vehicle," began to appear in large cities like Busan. These welfare centers, mostly private facilities, were given subsidies from the government based on the number of people they took care of. Meanwhile, police are said to have been rewarded for purifying the streets by sending people to these centers. Rough sleepers, disabled people, some orphan children, and even ordinary citizens who just failed to show their identification when asked, were allegedly taken to the centers as part of the Social Purification projects. Hyungjebokjiwon was one of the biggest of these welfare centers, not that far from a residential area in the southeastern port city of Busan. The owner, Park In-gwen, often insisted that they were there to feed, clothe, and educate the vagrants. On paper, each of the people who arrived at these centers should have only been kept inside for a year, given training, and then released back into society. The reality is that, for many, the next time they would see their friends and family again was in 1987, when the centers were forced to close after more than 30 escaped inmates blew the whistle on what was really happening behind their walls. Prison life. Choi Seung-woo, another Hyungjebokjiwon survivor, was 13 when he was taken off the streets on his way home from school. A police officer asked me to stop and started searching my bag, he told the BBC. There was half a loaf of bread, a leftover of my lunch which was given from school. He asked where I stole the bread from. He tortured me, burning my genitals with a lighter. He kept beating me, saying he wasn't going to let me go unless I confessed to the crime. Just wanting to go home, I lied. I stole it. Please let me go. About 10 minutes after he says he was forced to confess to a crime he did not commit, a freezer dump truck arrived and he was forced inside. Choi says that was the start of his prison life. He spent almost 5 years in Hyungjebokjiwon, in which time he says he saw and experienced brutal and physical violence. To keep control of the inmates, he says, the center was arranged like an army. Choi was placed in a platoon under the command of another inmate who had risen to become a platoon leader, given authority to educate others, and tacitly allowed to use physical force. The platoon leader and some other guys took all of my clothes off and poured a bucket of cold water on my body. While I was trying to sleep, shivering naked, the platoon leader came again and raped me. He did that to me for 3 consecutive nights until I was transferred to a different platoon. It took Choi just a week to realize that people are being killed here. I saw a guy wearing a white robe dragging an inmate across the floor, he says. He seemed dead. He was bleeding all over his body. His eyes were rolling back. The white robe guy didn't care at all and just kept dragging the man too somewhere. A few days later, a guy showed some sort of resistance by asking the platoon leader some forbidden questions like, "Why are we trapped in here? Why should we be beaten?" 4 people came and rolled him in a blanket. They kicked him all over his body until he fainted, foaming at the mouth. People took him out wrapped. He never returned to the center. I knew that he died. Aged just 8 when he arrived, Han says he was the youngest in his platoon and was usually given manual work, like folding envelopes or making toothpicks. He described the facility as hell. The only thing I was provided from the center was a set of blue training suits, rubber shoes, and a piece of nylon underwear. I rarely had a chance to take a shower. Lice were all over my body. We had rotten fish and stinking barley rice every day, literally every day. Almost all of the inmates were malnourished. 4 people slept in zigzags on a small bed. Rape occurred every night in the corner of the dormitory. Some people dreamt of an escape, he says, adding that some even tried running away, but it was almost impossible to get past the guards and jump over a 7-meter, 23 feet fence. If you tried, failure was not an option. I knew that if I failed to escape, I would be beaten to death, Han said. Some parents tried to get their children back. Choi's family searched everywhere for their beloved son. Choi says his family tried filing missing persons reports for him and his brother, who had also been taken to the center, but police simply ignored them. By the mid-1980s, rumors started spreading in Busan about people being death inside the so-called welfare center. Confident that his children were kidnapped and trapped in the facility, Choi's father knocked on the door of Hyungjae Bokjiwon. His protest led the center managers to release the brothers in 1986. A year later, Park In-gwen, who ran Hyungjae Bokjiwon, was arrested. The center was forced to close. Life after release was not easy, though. Choi says his life was like that of a beast. His brother took his own life in 2009. I was still a vagrant in the eyes of the society. I could only live a life of a vagrant, a beast. No one held out their hands for us. We were branded by the state and the people followed. Whenever I said I was in Hyungjae Bokjiwon, people were afraid of me. The mutual monitoring system made escape more difficult. Han says that sometimes mass escape was planned secretly, but there were always whistleblowers. Professor Park Suk-kyung of Kyunghee University, who took part in a recent investigation into what happened at Hyungjae Bokjiwon, pointed out the rule under which managers selected platoon leaders and gave them privileges helped maintain the whole detention system. The platoon leader I met said he had mixed feelings about what happened in the past. He said he saw himself as a bastard, but he did that to survive. If someone escaped, the platoon leader had to be punished instead. Han, meanwhile, had lost contact with his sister and his father, who had also ended up in the center. Eventually, in 2007, he found them being treated in hospital for the mental trauma inflicted during their years at the center. Waiting for Justice, a report into the center by the then opposition party published in 1987, found more than 500 detainees died under the inhumane treatment during the 12 years in which Hyungjae Bokjiwon was in operation. But nobody has ever been held to account for their deaths, nor the alleged human rights abuses which took place. Park was eventually sentenced to 2.5 years in prison only for embezzlement of state subsidies. He died of natural causes in 2016. 2 years later, the prosecutor who led the initial investigation into Hyungjae Bokjiwon confessed that there was external pressure by the military government to stop the investigation and demand a short sentence for Park. That same year, the then Prosecutor General Moon Moo-il formally apologized for the initial failures and requested that the Supreme Court review the ruling against Park, admitting that no proper investigation was carried out. Han has never given up hope of a proper investigation. He has been protesting in front of the South Korean National Assembly since 2012, demanding a state inquiry into Hyungjae Bokjiwon. Choi joined him in 2013. Earlier this month, Choi staged a rooftop protest and was later taken to a hospital. He's still attending psychotherapy sessions regularly. There is some hope, though. A new report by the Busan city government, seen by BBC Korean, clearly shows that Hyungjae Bokjiwon was not the welfare center it claimed to be. Every one of the 149 former inmates, including a platoon leader who took part in a survey, said they were held by force. A third of them have a disability, and more than half failed to receive a proper education. The team behind the report, Professor Park says, also believes there was a torture room hidden inside Park In-gwen's office. The report also shows Park's center benefited from the systematic segregation policy supported by the Chun administration during the 1980s. There are now signs those locked up in Hyungjae Bokjiwon may finally get the justice they have waited so long for. On the 20th of May, the South Korean National Assembly passed a bill, ordering the allegations be looked at again. The next day, President Moon Jae-in, who took part in the investigation in 1987 as a member of Busan District Bar Association, said that he was always sorry for failing to properly reveal the truth at that time, ordering a fresh investigation. It has given Han a sliver of hope. He has even stopped his protest in front of the National Assembly. I've always questioned myself. Did I really do something wrong to be taken to the hell-like facility? If so, was it that grave that my whole life should be destroyed? I don't think I could forgive the government and the people related for letting it happen. However, if they succeed in revealing what really happened in the facility and make an official apology for the victims, I would try to forgive. I will try. My only wish is for my family to be reunited like in the past when I was an 8-year-old boy who just loved to play with daddy and sister. The Brothers Home case is a human rights abuse case in which people who were identified as vagrants by the police and others were illegally detained, forced to work, and beaten by private social welfare corporations from the 1960s to the early 1990s. In 1975, the government issued the Guidelines for Reporting cracking down on housing and protecting vagrants, Hunjin, and cracked down on vagrants based on it. It was called Korea's version of Auschwitz because it was found that socially vulnerable people such as homeless people, youth, and people with disabilities were mainly housed in fraternal welfare centers. According to an August 2022 announcement by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 657 deaths occurred at the brothers' home between 1975 and 1988. A total of 34 state reparations lawsuits have been filed by victims of the incident. In December of last year, the Seoul Central District Court issued its first ruling recognizing state responsibility in a case in which 26 victims of the brothers' home program sought damages totaling more than 20.3 billion won, or 14.6 million. This was followed by a series of court rulings recognizing state liability in the sibling welfare cases. The government has appealed the first ruling and the case is headed for a second trial. How did something this horrific go unnoticed? Because the people behind Brothers Home had powerful connections. Wealthy elites, influential figures, and even the police were all in on it. Many people think the connection between Squid Game and real-life events like Brothers Home is purely fictional. Some even argue that the show wasn't inspired by this dark chapter in history. But what do you think? Could the creators have drawn inspiration from real events, or is it just a coincidence? Share your thoughts in the comments and I'll be sure to respond. If you found this story eye-opening, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's spread awareness about the real-life tragedies that inspired Squid Game and stand in solidarity with those still seeking justice.